episode 37. This is the first episode in an entirely new series about ecology. The study of ecology is the study of how organisms interact with other organisms, and how they interact with the physical terrain upon which they live. Ecology is basically the study of these interactions, and all kinds of interactions, really, like those between organisms and those between an organism and its abiotic environment, and even components of the abiotic environment interacting with each other. For example, bees and flowers interact in a mutually beneficial way. The bee gets nectar, the flower uses the bee to transport pollen. Many funguses interact with plants by growing into the cells in their roots. These fungi either symbiotically share or parasitically take nutrients from the host plant. The roots of trees hold the soil together against the rain and wind, making the soil stable enough for other organisms to live there, like smaller plants, fungi, and animals. Animals engage in a huge variety of interactions, like the birds that eat food from between an alligator's teeth, or the small fish that hang around larger fish and feed off of their scraps, or the maggots and vultures that scavenge on dead tissue. All of these interactions are ecological relationships. The relationship between predator and prey is ecological. So is the relationship between parasite and host, the relationship between symbiotes and mutualists, between habitat and inhabitant, between individuals in a population group and between population groups, you name it. Ecology is one of those things that's ever present. If you have two or more anythings interacting in any way, you can see some kind of ecological relationship there. These ecological relationships are like sandboxes for natural selection to play in, because the literal body structure and the behavior of any given organism defines the ecological role that that organism has. Groups of organisms or populations have their own collective behaviors, like grazing, stampeding, pack hunting, or whatever else. Then you have to consider groups of groups, or multi-species communities wherein a number of plants and animals and whatnot all coexist together. A number of communities spread across a chunk of geographic space makes an ecosystem, and the sum total of all the world's ecosystems is the Biosphere, the thin layer of thriving life that covers the surface of the planet. It's with these increasingly large levels of organization that ecologists study the living world. These 5 levels are organismal ecology, population ecology, community ecology, then ecosystem ecology, then the ecology of the global biome, of the entire biosphere. Organismal ecology focuses on the individual organism. This level of study involves looking at the behavior and the morphology and physiology that the individual organism has and that they use to live and thrive in their habitat. It looks at why certain individuals succeed during a high stress or a high competition event, and why other individuals fail. They either don't reproduce or they die. Organismal ecology basically studies the fitness of individual organisms and seeks to understand the nuances of their individual interactions with their environment. When you study one organism, you tend to see that it interacts in some way with other members of its species. This is population ecology, the next level, where researchers look at groups of individuals of a species, all living in the same region, like a herd of caribou, or a flock of birds, or a pack of wolves. Populations of organisms can have dramatic effects on the environment, like herds of grazing herbivores, or swarming insects, that can consume huge quantities of plant matter, and they can clean out entire habitats of vegetation. And this has numerous negative downstream effects for all of the species who use those plants as food, or for nests, or as cover and protection from predators, or any of 1,000 reasons. When you start to look at the interactions of populations from different species, you're looking at biological communities. Community ecology involves looking at these population-population interactions. And the most famous one I can think of off the top of my head is studying a predator population as it hunts and kills members of a prey population. There are natural cycles inherent in many systems, and the relationship between predator and prey is one such cycle. The population of prey animals rises, And shortly afterwards, the population of predators rises too, as they have more available food and they can support a larger population. But eventually, the swollen prey population requires more food than it can reasonably acquire in its habitat, and they start to experience starvation. The numbers of the prey population dwindle, and following shortly afterward is the predator population, which can't sustain its numbers with so few prey. When the predator population shrinks, the prey population suffers fewer deaths at the claws and fangs of predators, and their population increases once more, and the cycle makes another evolution. The predator population cycle follows on a slight delay from the prey population, but other than that, it follows pretty much exactly. This is an ecological understanding of a community relationship. Now that we're looking at how organisms interact at the level of the community, we can start to look at how these populations and communities engage with the physical, non-living environment around them. The living and non-living components together make up an ecosystem, and ecosystem ecology looks at how living things use and interact with non-living materials. For example, a river is an abiotic item. The river itself isn't alive, it's just a ribbon of flowing water, weaving its way down a landscape through the path of least resistance. But this flowing water presents opportunity and danger. Fish can swim in it and make the river their home, as do many arthropods like crabs and swimming insects, and amphibians. Animals can feed out of a river, like a bear which claws at salmon swimming upstream to reproduce. A larger river, or a cleaner river, might be able to support a larger population of salmon, which in turn can support more bears. These are all ecological relationships, flowing together in a complex, harmonious symphony. This symphony of ecosystem harmony moves nutrients and energy through space and time, and ecosystem ecology seeks to understand how and why those nutrients and energy get cycled in the way that they do. To fully understand this, we must step back to appreciate the largest level in the study of ecology, that of global ecology, of the Biosphere. The planet receives a finite amount of light energy from the sun, and this light energy propagates the planet's climate. Phototrophic organisms like plants absorb this light directly and turn it into chemical energy. This chemical energy is passed on to herbivores as they eat the plants, and then into carnivores as they eat the herbivores. All the plants and herbivores and carnivores are interacting on the planet's crust, roaming and flying over mountains and valleys and plains and rivers and all sorts of natural features. Understanding the sum total of all these abiotic and biotic factors and all their interactions on a global level is the purpose of global ecology. Besides humans, which have the intelligence to adapt to virtually any environment, there aren't any organisms that can survive or thrive in every habitat on Earth. Species have biological limitations, or biotic factors, that hamper their expansion into certain regions, because those regions have abiotic factors that make them inhospitable to a given species. For example, a polar bear can thrive on the Arctic ice sheets, but it will quickly overheat and die in a sandy desert like the Sahara. An amphibian, like a salamander, can do quite well for itself in a steamy jungle, where its permeable skin and low tolerance for cold temperatures really aren't problematic. But if that salamander were to be in a desert, it would die of dehydration in a matter of hours. And if it were in the Arctic, it would freeze to death in minutes. Fish can thrive in the ocean, but they don't do very well on the snowy peaks of a mountain ridge. Goats do great on mountains, but they die in the oceans as they can't swim very well or hold their breath very long. You might notice how animals and plants seem to be quite well adapted to their habitats. They've had millions of years of natural selection to sculpt them and help them fit perfectly into their habitat, becoming accustomed to all the abiotic and biotic factors that surround them. All organisms experience fitness trade-offs as they evolve to fit certain niches and to live in certain habitats. When the first lobe-finned fish began to migrate onto dry land, they began an evolutionary process wherein one trait was replaced by another in response to the abiotic factors they were experiencing. The ancestors of the lobed-finned fish had just normal fins for swimming in the water, but these became legs over millions of years of walking in mud and then drier land as they moved further and farther inland. The pressures of moving around on dry land encouraged the evolutionary adaptation of legs over fins. Fins work better in the ocean, but legs are clearly much better for dry ground. This works in reverse, too. Consider whales and dolphins, which are mammals whose ancestors were once land-dwelling organisms with legs. But these land-dwelling ancestor animals eventually returned to the sea, and their descendants' legs evolved into flippers, which are clearly better for swimming than legs designed for walking on dry land. In this case, the water in the marine habitat and the dry land in the terrestrial habitat are abiotic factors that influence the local ecology. Another abiotic factor is the shape of the land itself, including mountains, rivers, valleys, archipelagos, and even land bridges called an isthmus. The mountains act as a barrier to species movement, confining their migrations and their habitats and geographic ranges behind an impassable wall of rock. Mountains are also barriers to wind and clouds, which can have downstream effects on many nearby habitats. For example, if a mountain ridge prevents clouds from passing over them, the clouds would break apart against the mountainside and rain down on the wet side of the mountain. This side would be well hydrated, it would be fertile, it would be verdant, there'd be life growing everywhere, there'd be a lot of trees, a lot of vegetation. But on the other side of the mountain, it'd be really dry. It'd be much less fertile for life. It's because no clouds can ever make it over the mountain to drop rain over there. This kind of thing is called a rain shadow, because the drier region basically exists in the shadow of rainfall, which is always just over the mountain, but never overhead. Another barrier is a river. Rivers are a barrier to many species, but for other species, they act as a source of food or a means of transportation. Rivers, lakes, and the oceans themselves are also massive heat sinks. Because water has a high heat capacity, it can absorb and hold a lot of heat, which makes areas near bodies of water more temperate and less prone to temperature fluctuations or temperature extremes. This is why coastal areas and tropical areas with high humidity often have more stable climates and little to no seasonal temperature changes, while areas deeper inland are vulnerable to extremely hot summers and extremely cold winters. The notorious Siberian Winter is largely caused by the fact that the Siberian landmass is this massive, landlocked continental sheet of just flat, dry land. It's far from the ocean and it's really dry, and so in the winter it gets extremely cold, and in the summer it can get extremely hot with the sun directly overhead. Archipelagos, or strings of islands, are also pretty interesting, because they often contain similar, related species with minor divergences between individuals on different islands. This is the case in the Galapagos Islands, where finches were able to fly between the islands and establish local populations, and each population subsequently adapted to their specific island environment. This was the kind of thing that Darwin studied that kind of clued him into the nature of evolution and led him to publish on the origin of species. So on one hand, you have archipelagos, which are little islands, separated by expanses of water, and these little islands are like little tiny petri dishes of genetic diversity. And on the other hand, on the opposite side of the spectrum, you have the isthmus, or the land bridge. Land bridges are literally the opposite of the archipelago, because they provide a literal travel corridor for terrestrial species to move between two or more larger regions of land. For example, when the Panama Isthmus formed and it connected North and South America, it enabled thousands of species of insects, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians to cross from one continent into the other. This actually led to a huge diversification event called the Great American Interchange, where species that migrated from one continent to the other either died out or adapted to fit their new habitats. I think land bridges are pretty interesting from an ecological perspective because they do two opposite things at the same time. I already mentioned the obvious utility of a land bridge. It provides a travel corridor for terrestrial animals to migrate through or move through, but I haven't mentioned the opposite thing that they do yet. Land bridges, like the Panama Isthmus, bisect marine communities in half. When the Panama Isthmus formed, dry land literally rose out of the sea, creating a barrier between the Pacific Ocean to the west and the Atlantic Ocean to the east. The communities of flora and fauna that swam in the ocean or crawled along the seafloor were literally split in two by the land bridge, and this forced an evolutionary divergence in the separated populations. Life in the oceans are subject to just as many abiotic variables as life on land, if not more. Life in the oceans has to deal with the temperature of the water, which strictly limits where some organisms can and cannot live. They have to deal with the salt level of the water, or the salinity, which divides marine life into that which lives in freshwater or saltwater habitats. Most species of fish can't live in the opposite habitat. If you put a freshwater fish into the saltwater, like the ocean, it dies, and vice versa. The salinity of the water plays a huge role in the biochemistry of cells, as the ambient salt levels can affect organisms on the level of the cell by messing with osmosis and internal water regulation. The pH of the water is another factor that life must adapt to tolerate, as some regions are more acidic or more basic than others. Because of our industrial activity, we're producing a lot of carbon dioxide, and a lot of this carbon dioxide gets dissolved in seawater. The problem with this is that it lowers the pH of the ocean. The CO2 literally makes the ocean more acidic, and when that happens, bad stuff happens. All sorts of marine species, from corals to mollusks and arthropods, find that they can't produce shells in low pH water because the acidity messes with the calcium carbonate and prevents them from using it to make their shells. Perhaps the biggest abiotic factor that influences marine life is the presence of nutrients. It's surprisingly challenging to accumulate nutrients in the ocean, especially water-soluble nutrients like phosphorus. In water with strong currents or rapid flow rates, these water-soluble nutrients can get washed out. They never have a chance to accumulate, and local organisms never really get a chance to consume them in any sizable quantity. On the other hand, in still water, nutrients just settle to the bottom of the water body, onto the lake bed or the ocean floor, where the critters crawling around on the ground to get a chance to eat it, but the stuff swimming around in the water really doesn't. Obviously, life exists in the oceans, so how can it exist if the nutrients are so hard to come by? Well, there are other ecological phenomena that stir up the nutrients and redisperse them into the water. In the ocean, a combination of wind and the Earth's rotation can create what are called upwellings, where wind and Coriolis forces push upper layers of water in a certain direction, allowing for deeper water to come up to the surface. This creates a kind of a vertical current that can sweep nutrients up and out into the ocean. This only happens in the oceans, as these are the only bodies of water large enough for these geophysical mechanics to work. Lakes are too small, but lakes do have their own means of cycling nutrients, which is called lake turnover. The lake is like a small pocket of water, which can get warmed relatively easily by sunlight, especially in the summer when there's a lot more sunlight. During winter, a layer of ice forms on a lake. During the spring, the ice layer on top of the lake melts, and this cold water saturates the upper layers of the lake. This cold water is dense, and it sinks to the bottom of the lake while pushing up warmer water from below. This sinking and rising of water currents creates a similar sweeping or flushing action, which throws nutrients back up and into the lake water. This turnover is the cause for a burst in growth of plants and animals during the spring, as well as again in a separate event during the fall. Cooling air temperatures cause cooling water temperatures, and this cold surface water sinks to the bottom and pushes up warmer water, rich with nutrient sediment that's accumulated on the lake bed. In addition to cycling nutrients as water gets welled up, the colder, denser water that cycles down in both the spring and fall turnovers, that colder water, which was exposed to the air, brings oxygen down with it, and it reoxygenates the deeper marine environment in the lake. These seasonal cycles are hugely important for establishing the biological rhythms that the global ecology lives by. The climate is another seasonal abiotic factor of huge importance, which affects pretty much every organism, all life on the planet. Various climate and meteorological phenomena are responsible for creating stuff like the harsh bleakness of the high Arctic, the punishing barrenness of the open desert, and the lush density of vegetation in a tropical rainforest. Rainfall is important too, because rainfall directly feeds water into a region, which is required for plants and animal life. There's significantly more precipitation near the equator than anywhere else, which is why equatorial regions can support such dense biodiversity. This pattern of rainfall is part of a climate cycle wherein the moist air at the equator is warmed by the sun. This causes the warm air to rise higher into the atmosphere, where it eventually disperses and cools. When the water cools, the water vapor condenses, and it forms clouds, and if it keeps cooling, it condenses further into water droplets. When enough of these water droplets form, the cloud breaks apart and makes rain. As this cooler air rises, it moves towards the poles, dropping the bulk of its water as rain over the tropics. The colder, now drier air moves until it condenses and settles back down to the Earth's surface, where it absorbs moisture that it lost. The absorption of moisture makes these regions very dry, which is why the areas around 30 degrees latitude north and south of the equator are characterized by drier climates and more desert-like biomes. To fully appreciate all of the abiotic factors that have an ecological role in life on Earth, we have to look at the rotation of the planet itself. Earth rotates on a tilted axis. That is, the axis of rotation of the planet isn't exactly perpendicular to the plane of our orbit around the Sun. Because of this tilted axis, the northern and southern hemispheres receive different amounts of light energy at different times of the year. In the months in the middle of the year, like June and July, the northern hemisphere is tilted towards the sun. It's no surprise then that the plants grow best during the summer when there's ample light and a favorable growing climate. But at the same time, in the southern hemisphere, it's winter because the southern hemisphere is tilted away from the sun. The situation is reversed near the beginning and end of the year when it's winter in the northern hemisphere and summer in the southern hemisphere. The simple fact that the Earth rotates on a tilted axis is responsible for our seasons and the associated shifts in weather. All life on Earth must find a way to adapt to these seasonal changes. Some species don't have to do all that much, like a palm tree living in the equatorial tropics, where there's really no appreciable difference between summer and winter, while other species have to do quite a lot, like a birch tree living in the Canadian frontier, which has to lose its leaves every autumn and bunker down every winter, only to bloom again every summer. In this way, the abiotic influence of the seasons has dominated the very reproduction and growth schedules of the planet's life. In this way, the abiotic influence of the seasons has dominated the very reproduction and growth schedules of the planet's life. So there's both abiotic and biotic factors, and these factors are things that generally limit the range of a species, or the areas that it can live and successfully reproduce. Abiotic factors I just discussed. They're parts of the non-living environment that the living world must take into consideration or adapt to or learn to handle in some way. The biotic factors are things caused by other living organisms. For example, if a particular plant is the host to a parasitic fungus, and that fungus uses no other species of plant as a host, then the range of that fungus will necessarily mirror that of the host plant. This is simply because the parasitic fungus can't live anywhere else, on any other organism. It's limited to the same range its host is. Similarly, if an animal is dependent on a specific food source, like a plant or a particular species of prey, the animal doing the eating simply can't live away from the organism it depends on to eat, which links the two species geographically. So you have that, but there's also cases of the inverse biotic factors. Like when a parasite is so deadly that it's literally forced animals out of certain areas. This is the case in Africa, where the disease-carrying tsetse fly has killed off many species of grazing herbivore in specific regions, to the point where the herbivore's natural habitat range barely overlaps, if at all, the range of the tsetse fly. A similar situation exists in Hawaii, where birds live at higher altitudes than the mosquitoes, which carry a strain of avian influenza. The birds simply can't stand to share a habitat with the mosquitoes because they're so deadly to them. So this ecological relationship has literally forced the birds to adapt to a habitat at a higher altitude just to get away from the mosquitoes and the bird flu. You could also say that this is happening with humans with sickle cell anemia and malaria. Malaria is a parasitic infection of the blood, of your blood cells, and it requires a certain consistency in the shape and structure of the blood cell in order to be an effective pathogen. The malaria has to be able to bind to and enter the blood cell. But in people with sickle cell anemia, their blood cells are warped and distorted. They're literally curved like sickles, or like flattened, dehydrated water balloons. While this comes with a host of its own health problems, it does offer a unique, context and region-specific advantage. If you have sickle cell anemia, malaria has a much harder time infecting you than it does with people who have normal, healthy blood cells. In areas of Africa with high rates of sickle cell anemia, rates of malarial infection are actually relatively rare, and they're going down because the pathogen is struggling to infect blood cells it can barely recognize as blood cells. These are all examples of ecological relationships, of biotic and abiotic factors influencing the geographic ranges, the behaviors, the diets, and the lifestyles of the organisms that live on this little blue planet. I think that about covers most of the fundamentals of ecology. Before I end the episode, I want to briefly talk about a few cool ecology facts and tidbits. Earlier in the episode, I mentioned the Biosphere, which is the thin sphere of habitable space on the Earth's crust and in its oceans. I wanted to know, how thick or thin is this biosphere? At what altitude does no life naturally exist? At what depth? Large organisms like plants and animals exist in a pretty thin biosphere that hugs the crust pretty tightly. First of all, they're limited to the ground, to the surface of the planet. Some birds and mammals can fly higher than the surface, obviously, but they can't always live in the sky. They have to land to sleep, or build a nest, or nurture their young. Have you ever looked at a mountain or a big hill and noticed that the trees stop at some point up the slopes? There may be trees on the base, trees on the lower and middle slopes, but at some height up the mountain, they just stop, forming a line or a wall of trees. This tree line can vary between 3,000 to 8,000 meters in altitude, depending on the region and the local climate. And beyond the tree line, there lives not much more than grasses and shrubs and other simple plants, as well as goats and yaks and other various mountain-dwelling creatures. But higher than this, complex life tapers off pretty quick. It's just too cold. There isn't enough rain or nutrients in the soil, if there's even soil at all. Even on the only habitable planet that we know of in the universe, you go to too great an altitude and you just go right back into inhospitable territory. The highest point on the terrestrial surface of the Earth is Mount Everest, which is about 8,850 meters tall at its peak. But no life lives natively in the highest regions. So that's the mountains and the land, but what about the oceans? How deep past sea level can complex life exist? Complex life, like crabs, prawn, and marine plants, can exist on most of the sea floor, and recent discoveries have shown complex life to exist at extreme depths, like in the Mariana Trench, which is almost 11,000 meters below sea level. Microbes are now known to thrive in the Mariana Trench, which really isn't that surprising, because microbes and other such shingle-celled organisms have been discovered virtually everywhere, from deep-sea hydrothermal vents to salty geothermal hot springs. But what isn't as well known is that microbes can also live deep into the crust itself, deep inside the rock and the soil, for miles. Numerous studies have shown microbial life to exist and to thrive more than a kilometer underground. Microbes have even been found inside cores drilled out from miles within the crust. Experiments in Sweden have demonstrated microbes growing plentifully in rock more than 5,000 meters deep, or for those of you who don't use metric, 16,000 feet into the ground. Some microbes have been found in rocks as deep as 19 kilometers, or 12 miles underground. All of these subterranean microbes live off the geothermal and hydrothermal energy of the planet. In the deepest parts of caves and mines, and in the deep parts of the crust, the temperatures get really high as the heat from the Earth's core and its liquid mantle seeps upwards to the surface. This internal heat from the Earth's core and its mantle seeps upwards to the surface, feeding what's called the deep biosphere, or part of the deep biosphere. It feeds the underground part of the deep biosphere. All these subterranean microbes use this geothermal energy to survive. But the deep biosphere, which is really the full account of all the microbes on the planet, extends way higher into the atmosphere and way deeper into the mantle than the biosphere accessible to complex multicellular life. This deep biosphere represents nearly 5 times 10 to the 17th grams worth of organic carbon, which is apparently close to the mass of the islands of the United Kingdom. That's a lot of weight, and it's all microbes, which are microscopic single-celled organisms, but they just cover everything, and there are trillions and trillions and trillions. I'll explore the various levels of ecological study in the next few episodes, but that's pretty much it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something cool about ecology. It's such an interesting topic, and I feel like when you learn about ecological principles and mechanisms, it changes the way you see the world. You begin to notice and pick up on all the ways energy and resources are distributed and cycled through time and space, and you start to see things that you wouldn't ordinarily see in a biological context. You start to see how even things like the economy or grocery stores or anything all operate on ecological principles. I'm just going to leave you with that little food for thought, and as always, thanks for listening.
Would you like to support the BioLogic podcast? It's super easy. When you open a new episode, press the like button or share it with your friends. If you aren't subscribed, you should hit the subscribe button so you can enjoy a new episode every week. You can also peruse our official store, which has a ton of cool stuff like hand-designed t-shirts, hoodies, and stickers. All the links you need are in the description section below.